Hello, welcome back and good morning. Today we're going to be doing part three, all right? Part three of our tic-tac-toe game. Now, I think on this project, I spent a lot more time on CSS than normal, not just because I wanted to spend a lot of time tweaking how things look, so I usually spend a lot more time with the JavaScript, but because I have a static game board. Now, usually we use Bootstrap in our project so that way we have a responsive design. This time, we're going to have a very static game board, and we're going to have static squares we have to lay on top, and everything has to line up just right. So it required a lot of fiddling. So what I've done is I'm just going to give you my numbers that I used, but just know that it does take a little bit of fiddling because you have to have all the squares the same size. Then they have to fit inside of our game board. And then in between all of our square classes, we have our lines, right? And those lines actually add a thickness. So I'm just going to kind of go through, give you the numbers that I used, and then try to resize this stuff yourself and try to play with the math and see how increasing each border width by, say, 1 or 2 pixels, how does that affect the overall size of the squares and the game board itself? So give that a shot. Don't just go through and copy what I'm doing, or you can as a template to then go back and kind of mess with it to make sure you get a real strong handle on how to go ahead and do this. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's jump right into our IDE here. Remember that we already have all of our folders set up. We have our index files set. We already know we're going to have custom classes such as game board, square, and square one, a custom spacer that, if you've followed my other videos, I like to just use a little spacer class just to give me the right spacing at the top. Just kind of makes it easy, especially for these little single page things that we're doing here. And we have, yeah, that's ready to go. So let's go into our CSS. Notice our CSS is in our CSS file. That's linked in the head of our HTML. So we can go ahead and get started with this. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is let's address some of these custom classes here. And so the first one I'll get is our game board. Notice I start typing game board here, and it automatically knows that I'm going to want to mess with this game board because I've already marked that as a custom class. Another good thing about using an IDE is that it has all these little custom snippets for you that makes your life a lot easier. So I'm going to start off with the width here. And the width that I ended up on, or I settled on, was 372 pixels. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the height because it's going to be a square, right? So 372px for pixels. And then the next thing that I want to do is just make sure I have an auto margin. Okay, so margin auto takes care of that. And that's all you really have to do for your game board. All right, so we have an overall height, a width, and that's about it. Now you're not going to be able to see anything. All right, I'm going to save this. And again, you're not really going to be able to see much, except that now we have a space here for our game board. If you remember from our last video, this reload game button was all the way up at the top because now we have 372 pixels by 372 pixel square that has an auto margin, so it's in the center of our screen, and it starts from the bottom of this tic-tac-toe to the top of this button. And we're going to have to add in some spacers in there as well, or we have added in spacers. We just have to make sure that the computer knows what it is. So next thing I want to do is the next custom class I'm going to grab is my custom square class, and notice that the snippet that it's grabbing, it comes directly from the index.html file. It automatically knows that's what I want, which is good. The first thing that we want to do is we have all of these different divs. So you have all these different squares initially that are going to want to kind of come down this way. We want to make sure that they float left. All right. So we want them to actually fill up that 372 square space and then drop down and then populate from left to right again. So in order to do that, we're going to float this, float, and then you can kind of see the options that you get here. So I want float left. The next thing, I want an RGBA background. And the reason I want RGBA is because I want this to be a white game board, but I want to kind of see through it a little bit, which would be your alpha. So I'm going to go and add in a background. Okay. And that background is just going to be RGB, red, green, blue, alpha. And our RGBA is just going to be white. So white, remember, is 255 on all channels. 5 to 55, comma. And now I need a factor from 0 to 1 in terms of opacity for alpha, which I will make 0.9 because that's sort of what I settled on. I think it looks good. And if you want to make it darker or lighter, just change it. So if it's 1, it's going to be solid. If it's 0, you're not going to be able to see it at all. The next thing I'm going to do with each square class. So the square classes is what I'm talking about here. So the individual square class. Now, if I did this RGBA to the entire game board, then even the X's and O's that I place on them themselves, okay, the X's and O's would have that little bit of opacity, but I want the X's and O's to be solid. So you actually have to add that to the individual class, and then you're going to put something on top of that. So let's go again, and we're going to add the width. Okay, so the width and the height. And now remember that the width is going to depend on this number up here, this game board divided by 3. However, I'm also going to place a border on this, and I'm going to do that with a border, and then I add a box shadow as well. So because I add a border and a box shadow, the way I have it set, that's why I ended up with 372. But the width itself, all right, is going to be 122 pixels. All right, and then I want the height to be 122 pixels, okay? And you're gonna have to trust me on this, because what I'm gonna do is I'm also gonna add in a border, so that way we can see them. When I'm done with the border, then I'm gonna jump over and show you what this looks like. So I have a border of 1 pixel, all right, that's all I really need. And I want that to be solid black, okay? And then I'm gonna save this. And notice this is what we have. So now I have your height, the width, the background, and a 1 pixel solid border. So note that because you have a 1 pixel solid border here all the way around, that's what 1 pixel looks like. But over here, it's actually 2 pixels now, because you have 1 pixel from the bottom square and 1 pixel from the top square, and the same thing here. So you actually get this stronger, more pronounced grid here. All right. The next thing that I'm going to do is we can play with box shadow, because I like the box shadow. So what I've done is I've actually copied some box shadow that I've figured out from before, only because it's a lot of typing. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go ahead and figure out what a box shadow should look like. So here's a box shadow. And again, the reason that you have this, box shadow and then this stuff up here for box shadow, that's just so you're compatible with the other browsers. All right. Height border, okay. Just checking my warnings here, which is fine. So then I'm going to want to have a box shadow here for the of 8 pixels, 15 pixels, and it has a color. So you can kind of see how we have these, and what you're going to have is how far away this is, how far away this thing dissolves in each direction. And so what you want to do is, if you want to learn more about box shadow, there's a bunch of examples online, plus giving you the different values. But again, play with these values and see what you get. What you can do is you can actually get rid of these things. This is just a duplication of your box shadow to make sure it works in the different browsers. But really kind of play with these numbers and take a look at the box shadow. It's really cool. It's sort of outside of the scope of this right now to go into the exact box shadow, but we've used it before. So if you've watched my other videos, I've gone into that in a little more detail. But I don't want to get into that right now. The next thing that I want to do is I want people to know that they can click on these things. So right now, when I mouse over, you can't tell that you can click on them. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to do that by messing with the cursor. All right. And the cursor you can change to anything you want. And you notice it can be an auto. You can make it a crosshair. You can resize it. You can inherit. And look at all of these different things you can do. All right. So what do I want to do? Well, I just want to make it a pointer. What does a pointer do? Save it. Oh, look. Now it looks like I can touch it, just like a button, right? And you already can see that this button's right on top of here. That's not good. That's not good. So I'm going to go ahead and bounce back over to here. What else do I want? I want my text to be centered on this. So I'm going to have a text line center. And I'm going to set my font size. Now, this font size, how do you know what to make the font size? Well, I'm going to use font awesome, right? And I'm going to use, so you can adjust your font size of your X's and O's with this as well. So I'm going to make this 100 pixels. And again, this is after a lot of fine tuning. And so the way you fine tune it is that after this is done, you give yourself some basic values and you notice, okay, your X's and O's are too small, so I'm going to go adjust the font size here. I'm going to adjust. So this is after a lot of adjustment that I've settled on these numbers. This isn't something that I've known ahead of time or I figured out mathematically on a piece of paper. First, I put in values that I knew. Then I started adjusting box shadow. I said, okay, I've adjusted the box shadow, and now this is happening. So what do I do now? And so on and so forth. So this is how I get this little 3D box. All right. So let's go back to my CSS file. So I have the font size, text align, cursor border done. The next custom class that we're going to want is, well, let's do the X's and O's. Here you notice I don't have any X or O classes. Well, what I'm going to do is I am going to be appending these X and O classes, and those X and O classes are going to have the font awesome X's and O little icons on them. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to have a custom class for X and O. So I'm going to have an X class, okay, which is going to contain my X's. All right. And all I want to do is make sure that all knows that the background color is just set to white to make sure that it pops through. You don't really have to do this necessarily, but this way you can actually change the color of your boxes themselves. And the reason that I originally used this is when I was figuring out the JavaScript stuff, instead of actually already adding the font awesome to it, when I clicked on it, I just wanted to change the background color of the box itself. So this is for the functionality of the game board. So initially when I was figuring out the JavaScript, I just had an X and an O class that changed the color. And then I went through and I figured out how I wanted my game to work just with different colors. So this was a simple method for me to use that X and O class to figure out what I was clicking on. And then I just set that later to just white. So background color white is good enough. All right, and then you can use this as well if you want to change how your game works. It just makes it easier. All right, so if you don't want to use the font awesome stuff, and again, I want a background color of white. Okay, so that's why this is here. Obviously, it's already going to have a background color of white because everything else here is white. But like I said, this is for troubleshooting, debugging, especially if I don't want to use the font awesome stuff. So you can use this. You're going to need a .x or .o anyway. Shouldn't be prepending stuff, but that's different. So let's take a look at our body here. Our body, now remember, I have some basic code that I use for this, and I've used it on a bunch of stuff. So what I'm going to do is grab my body, and if you've seen, copy and paste this. If you've seen my other videos, you know that on the body itself, since it's already a class known as, since it's the body of your actual thing, you don't need any dots or hashes on there. And again, this is just what I figured how to use. Control S. Right. So I went and I found a background. So the first thing you're going to want to do is find a background that you like. So I've picked a background. You can kind of see my 0.9 alpha in here, my box shadow, how this looks. And that's the background, and then URL. Okay. And with the URL, well, what was that noise? That was weird. My laptop just had something funky happen. Anyway, so what this is gives you your URL. And you can see that I've used the URL here of anything. So I went to Google, found some X's and O's, and populated this in. Also, what I've done is I've added this background size to cover. All right. And the background to no repeat. All right, centered, and I have it fixed. If you don't have it fixed, the whole size of this, you're going to be able to scroll and see more of the size. I just want this one size of this one picture to cover everything. And this is very similar to what I've done in all of my other videos, and you can kind of see that this works. I'll leave it up here for a second for you to look at as I'm talking. Since I've gone over this a bunch of times in other videos, I'm not going to go over it again. All right, so if you want, you can check out a bunch of my other videos. I even go over it and everything from the portfolio project all the way up through everything else that I've done. So, If you're familiar with this, you probably actually have this on your other projects anyway, or however you want to set your background. So set your background however you see fit. You should already be able to have this. All right. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is this spacer class. All right. Now, the spacer class is what I am using to add space in between the button and the top here. I'm going to just have this be symmetrical. So I have a spacer here and a spacer in between here as well. So the spacer, the way I'm going to add this spacer is going to be, this is actually going to be responsive. And the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm just going to be adding a general padding, okay? And the padding, you can have a top, bottom, however you see this, but the padding that I like to use is 5%. It just happens to work pretty well for spacing. And you can see what that 5% padding looks like. And so now I have, it'll cover my screen. Now I'm in a smaller window here, so you can't really see it, but even on my laptop, which has very, well, not very good resolution, you can kind of see what 5% turns out to be. And if I go full screen, it's actually perfect even on this older screen that I'm using here with a lower resolution. So I just kind of like it because it looks good on my computer and that I use at work here, my work laptop. And even my work desktop, and just kind of looks good overall. And even when I go home to my 4K monitor, it still holds up and looks good. Since I have text here inside of these spacers, I want to make sure that I align the text with my text align, and my text align I want to be center. And I do want a shadow on my text. Okay, so how does my text shadow work? So text shadow, you can kind of play with this. And so the way I've gone through is I've just gone through, honestly, if you're going to want to research some of these CSS elements, because this is how you customize this. This is just how I customized my text, right? This is where you really can get in and make your thing different. So the way I figured this out was honestly just playing with it. So 1 pixel, 1 pixel, 2 pixels. Again, the shadow, and you can kind of see what each one of these mean if you go through and you type in CSS, text shadow. All right, so CSS, text shadow. And again, you can kind of pick any of these, like, MDN is a little better. All right, here's look. So you have offset X, offset Y, a blur radius, and a color. All right, then you can also have like global variables set up for this. And then you can break this even down into even further. And again, you can get all the way into this and kind of see what you want here. Here you go, and you can actually set different colors on these shadows as we go through. So you actually have the text itself, and then you have the blue here, and then another blue, so you can kind of see what this will look like. And again, so you can see how we have different types of shadow on here as well, where if you look really closely, you can actually have like a black in here, and then a bit of a blue, and then even a further blue, where how far away that it diffuses. And so that's what I've done as well. And this is just me playing with it and getting something that I like. And what I settled on, actually, I'm just going to copy this here because I don't want to retype. I want to make sure that it looks exactly how I have it. And again, so I'm actually going to paste it in from one of my ones that I finished. This is what I've settled on to make it look the way that I want it to look. All right. And again, this came from a lot of fiddling with everything to look the way that I wanted it to look. All right. So it's going to be different for you. All right. And then I have a color set. All right. To white. And then the font. Okay. And a font, again, is a very personal thing. And so, and the deal with font is you have a very specific font, and then you determine all the way down to, all right, so here's your generic one. Then if they have this, they don't have this, they'll move to the next one, so on and so forth, all the way down to your generic serif font if your browser doesn't support those fonts. So this is what I ended up with, and you can kind of see how I have a very large shadow, then a tighter one in here for all of my stuff. And you can kind of see how this works. And mine actually has both people winning. So I have my Hal has one, and then I have player one has one. And obviously, when this page first loads, well, what's going to happen is I'm going to hide these right here. I'm going to hide these divs, and then only show them when player has one or the computer has one. All right. So again, you can either take what I have here or pause the video, or you can comment out, play with text when you come back. You can use a shadow. You have a generic color for your text. And obviously, my text is white because my color is white because I'm actually using the text shadow to offset everything. Why? So that way it matches my game board. And even though this is solid white, I think it kind of looks good just like this with offset with my black. And notice how my larger shadow I use for my contrast, and that's how come I have this here in here as well. So I have a tighter shadow and a wider shadow, and with my white font. So that's how I made that. All right. The next thing that I did, or the last piece that I have, all right, is I actually had a class. I've modified the Bootstrap BTN class. All right. The only thing that I've done is I've just made sure that I have everything centered. All right. And so how do I do this? All right. And you can modify your BTN or your button class. All right. And so, that's going to be a BTN, which we already know is going to be Bootstrap. But I just want to do more things with this. So I want to offset my button to give it this same sort of shadow. So how do I do that? I want it to have the same shadow as my square and everything else. So I want it to have the same shadow depth as this. So how do you do that? Well, since I want it to have the same shadow as that, the same box shadow, it's easy enough to come up and grab this. Control C, Control V. Okay, and then I'll save. And now my button has the same shadow. And if you don't like this shadow, if you think that's too far off the game board and you think this should be tighter, which looking at it again, maybe I'll adjust it. I've adjusted this 100 times to kind of get it to look the way I wanted it to look. And again, that was just messing with this over and over and over again. The biggest things for you to figure out here are going to be, all right, your game board and your square. How to get your squares to line up, to get a shadow on your game board itself, and to make sure that this actually offsets. And I think with having just this one border all the way around gives me the 2-pixel border in here. So now your game board has to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so you have to have 6 in the width and the height more than the size of your squares. So you have to add that up. So you can do the math. So you have 6 there. You have to add just in borders. All right. So then you have 122 times 3 of these things in the height and width. So 122 times 3 equals 366 plus 6, right, is 372. Let me say that again. So you have 122 pixels. So 122, 122, 122. All right. That's 366, right? So 366, and now let's add in the border. So 367, right? And then 367 plus 2 is 369. 369 plus 2 is 371. And then plus another one is 372. So your overall game board needs to be 372, right? And just in case here. And then you have a width of 122 with the 1-pixel border, because the 1-pixel border doubles up in between to give you that stronger contrast between your squares. So you can see, you can do this mathematically at first, all right, or you'll notice that everything doesn't quite line up right. All right, and again, this comes from kind of messing with this, and if you need a calculator, that's fine, grab a calculator. All right, So hopefully this was helpful, and you can kind of see at this point you should be well on your way to messing with all of your text and how everything looks and how you want it to look and your shadows and your colors of everything. So go ahead now and finish up. You should be in a good enough spot that you can kind of get your aesthetic down, and that should take you a while to get something that looks the way you want it to. Alrighty, well hopefully that was helpful, everybody, and I will see you all next time.